the only name listed on that thread.
Yeah, no, strange. I am the officially worst Irish influencer. Well, as far as HMRC are concerned, I am an influencer. So maybe this guy works for HMRC, although from, who knows. But you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. We're on the Patreon feed. We are back with another artist in our artist series, and you could probably guess from the title. Oh, also I'm Tom. I'm joined by Matt. You know who we are at this stage. If you're just joining us on this episode, hello. If you're joining us again, you get a second hello.
Hello in particular to Doug and Ben, who are basically working at the stage as like unpaid fact checkers of this podcast.
Why? What? Matt was in Berlin last weekend. What did they tell you?
No, neither of them were in Berlin. But I've just after every episode, just get follow-up messages from particularly from Doug, actually. And this is going to be another one where I'm sure I'll make mistakes and Doug will happily jump in. He gave me a whole deeper cut history on the Taz tattoo sheet, which we can follow up at a future event.
In a corrections episode.
Yeah, Matt Lodder was wrong.
Surprise.
Frequently.
You didn't even know when An Outcome the Wolves came out, and I was right and you were wrong. Despite the fact that album came out before I was born.
See, the problem is, right, and this is so to dear listeners, some of whom might have been there with me. I was at the BMXnet Body Modification Conference at the weekend in Berlin. I bumped into Paul King, friend of the show. Him and I were doing lots of stuff together. Aaron Dieter Wolf happened to be in Berlin. Loads of other people are in Berlin. But it turns out loads of people are really interested in like the 90s and 2000s. And we're speaking to like people like me and Paul and Hover and my friend Sana from Japan and Ryochi from Japan. All these people that I've known for freaking ever about the 2000s. And we're like, oh, is that interesting to people? I don't know. And we're trying to, I've just spent this afternoon trying to like fill in lots of gaps about what we were doing in about 2002 because people were interested. It's good. No, it's good.
Even if you look at like the, we had a post go viral on Instagram over the weekend. It was just like, every Friday morning, I try and find weird tattoo stuff on YouTube. I figured out now that if you can figure out the model number of very popular camcorders, you can type them into YouTube, and because they're like if someone uploads something without changing the name of it has a default file name, so you can find weird stuff on YouTube.
Okay.
So I like try and find, it's like, oh, is there like, it's a load of like boring stuff that like people testing their cameras or whatever. But like I'm trying to find, maybe is there like tattoo stuff that like no one has like found yet. But I found some interesting like docs and everything. And I found one that BBC Wales did in 1990 about tattooing in Wales, and put it up, and like people loved it. And like the 90s and 2000s are back.
Apparently so. We were talking because the BMXnet is more of a body mod conference than a tattoo one. So lots of people interested in kind of suspension and piercing history. And we were talking about someone came up to Paul and said, oh, I'm really interested in like if you've got any like real sort of suspension history stuff you can share with me. And Paul was like, well, yeah, I've got these really amazing like, lithographs of like Indian as in Indian hook swinging from like the 18th century or something. And the guy was like, no, from the 2000s.
Yeah. But this is the thing, is like a lot of, I think we will get into the actual topic of this episode in a sec, but like as contemporary history has moved on, like historians who have at least gotten enough acclaim to be notable enough to write books or whatever, they're old enough where the stuff that they care about is the 60s, 70s and 80s, whereas like the historians that are like in their like mid to late 20s don't have enough clout yet to write about the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah, and I think I've just said on this show before, like I find it very difficult, I think everybody does find it very difficult to think about things that, especially if they're professional historians, weirdly, to think about things that they witnessed firsthand or participated in firsthand as the same thing as the other work that we do. So I'm really realizing that there's real value in, trying to like make a bit more. Because even for myself, I'm just trying to, it's been annoyingly difficult to dig out some photos of these events. Lots of them are on.
And ironically, in the
I've got a whole pile of CDs and DVDs here with photos and film on that I've got no way of actually accessing. So
see, as we have moved into the age where tattooing is now more popular than ever, and there is more like literal photographic evidence of it, it's just once again everything has just disappeared. No one has really categorized anything because it lives on like people like Matt's computers.
yeah, and I can't find photos of my first suspension, body suspension that I did in 2003. I've got half of an email thread from 2003 saying, "Here's the picture, suspension 152.jpg." and I'm pretty good at backing stuff up. I'm not super organized, but I have tried to keep stuff, but clearly I haven't got that, or if I haven't found it on my hard drive yet. So it's kind of, this stuff's obviously interesting to people, and it's been interesting to remember. The things we live through is also interesting. I also want to, before we actually get to the topic of this episode, also because it may come up again. Before we start today, I also just want to, speaking of corrections, I got a really amazing message after the last Patreon episode that we did about Pinky Young, from a friend of mine who is from Hong Kong originally, and just kind of pointing out that I'd been pretty sloppy when I was quoting, and wasn't particularly clear when I was quoting some of that problematic language, where Sailor Jerry was talking about quote unquote Orientals, and I hadn't, in the way that I was presenting that information, hadn't quite properly and clearly demarcated what was in quotes, and I'd sort of repeated it shortly afterwards in quotation marks in my mind, but didn't make it clear, and it sounded like I was repeating this kind of reduction of the entire half of the planet into a singular racialized category, and that which I really apologize for. I know better and should do better, and I'm very grateful and lucky to have friends who can send me polite messages who aren't kind of who send me a message and say, look, you didn't do well enough there, and this also then brought up this conversation about the term that I use often, not just in that episode, about Oriental, quote unquote, Oriental tattooing. And what I mean by that, and the reason I've used that term, and I think why the industry has used that term, is because that term covers more than just Japanese tattooing specifically. It covers kind of American appropriation and remixing of Japanese material. It covers tattoo traditions from China and Southeast Asia more broadly. And actually, I think a better term for that stuff is not Oriental, but Orientalist. And so if listeners haven't read the really pioneering book Orientalism by Edward Said, who sort of theorized this, Orientalism is the colonial practice or the of exoticizing and flattening and appropriating and basically racistly collapsing loads of different things from the Caucasus eastwards, everything from Central Europe and Turkey right up into kind of the southern parts of China, of Russia and Mongolia and Kazakhstan, all the way through China, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, like Indonesia, Philippines, like that whole part of the world with all those amazing thousands of years of history and thousands and thousands and thousands of different cultural groupings and language communities and everything, making them into this one non-Western exotic thing. And the original and justified point that my friend made was that I should be more careful not to say Orientals as a noun. I listened back and I realized that I just basically was repeating some stuff that Silgeria had said, but I hadn't made it clear that I wasn't endorsing it. But also this adjective Oriental, I think, has its kind of historical utility in actually talking about stuff that isn't authentically from a particular place, but is a kind of imaginary. But I think technically Orientalist is a better style for that. a term for that stuff when it's kind of viewed through this Western lens of appropriation. So I'm going to try and do that. I'm very, very grateful. I'm not going to name my friend. I didn't ask them if they wanted their name read out, but they did call me out on this, and I'm very, very grateful. And I really invite other people and people do this where we don't script these shows very strongly. They're conversational. Things sometimes aren't super clear. Like one of the things that Doug emailed about was that I basically said that the Pinky Young book was the Ed Hardy book at the beginning of the episode because it came from a collection of Eds, but he didn't put it out. It was published by Tacky in Seattle. I said we went into that a lot at the end of the episode. But if you will spot mistakes and errors, please feel free to email me and let us know. Some of it's going to be slips of the tongue. Some of it's going to be gaps in my knowledge. Some of it's going to be ignorance. Some of it's just going to be sloppiness. And we really invite those kind of conversations. And I apologize. In fact, that my correspondent said she would have liked to have shared that more broadly, but felt that it would have been hard for her to do that, given quite early on in the episode, it sounds, at least to people that don't know us, that I was making a clumsy elision. And of course, the whole point of that episode and the whole point of doing the show is to try and get rid of clumsy elisions and things that repeat the mistakes of the past. So I really apologize. We'll definitely try and do better. And when I don't do better in future, please feel free to call me out privately or otherwise, because we only learn by having these conversations.
We're cancelling Matt online. I'm doing it because of that mustache. But anyway, yes. Matt currently has a John Waters mustache. So, to the meat of the episode, who are we talking about? And this is someone that I wasn't familiar with until you mentioned them to me.
Yeah, well, this is why this came up, because it's so in the aftermath of talking about Pinky Young, who obviously I think most people listening to this will have listened to that episode, but who, if you haven't listened to that episode, was a Hong Kong-based tattoo artist who eventually found his way to the West Coast of the United States, became a friend and correspondent of Ed Hardy's, and was a big important figure in the 70s in kind of in that part of revival of Orientalist trends. And there's that conversation, so, we should do a episode about this other guy, because this other guy is also someone that was around about a bit later on, and he actually fits in quite specifically in the gap before another person we've talked about, Dan Higgs, because shortly after the events that we'll recount today is what leads Dan Higgs to start working at Realistic Tattoo with Ed Hardy. So again, I apologize if we're a bit kind of in the weeds here, but these are just, when we're thinking about what to put together, we have conversations ourselves that lead on to one another. And I show Tom stuff that goes, oh yeah, we should do stuff about this obvious thing that we didn't mention. And Tom, I don't know anything about this guy. So all of that preamble, you already know because you clicked on the name of the podcast, but we are doing today's episode about Greg Irons.
So cool. Like when Matt was sending me not just tattoos, but illustration and comic stuff from Greg Irons, I was like, this is right up my alley. This is badass biker tough guy shit.
Yeah, from a guy who, super political as well in all the right ways. But Greg came to tattooing fairly late in his career because he was basically working as a commercial artist. So we'll talk more about it, but the basic overview of his career is that he worked initially as a kind of commercial illustrator. He played in bands in the 60s around the West Coast of the United States. He did posters. Actually, he went to Philadelphia College of Arts. He was also around in the East as well. He was doing gig posters, really kind of amazing, psychedelic gig posters. He then went on to a career doing stuff around the hippie movement in the 60s, so posters for hippie festivals and that real kind of summer of love kind of period. Then he got into Californian counterculture and started getting involved with the underground comic scene in the late 60s around Crumb and Wilson and Spain Rodriguez and stuff. He then became a kind of political illustrator, working for like underground um, publications in San Francisco, drawing amazing images of strikes and political protests. He was doing political cartooning during the Vietnam War. He ended up doing some illustration for or some drawing for Yellow Submarine, the Beatles movie, which also bizarrely my wife's grandfather's second wife was also an illustrator on that film. So I wonder if they knew each other. Degrees of separation. Basically found that like this kind of countercultural life like wasn't really paying the bills, or it was certainly harder to pay the bills. And so in the late 70s, he got into tattooing, made a very big impression very quickly on the tattoo community. And then very sadly, very, very young, almost like in the first few years of his tattoo life, was hit by a bus in Thailand and died in 1984. In between that, he also did like coloring books for like Dungeons and Dragons and like all kinds of mad shit that we'll get into in detail. But we're talking about a guy who didn't tattoo for very long, but lives on in the kind of lexicon of people that know what they're talking about as someone who was, even with his short impact, massively influential, right? Do you want to talk about like the kind of thoughts you had when I first sent you some of those pictures of Irons' work, and then we'll talk about his life in a bit more detail, chronologically speaking. We're going to be drawing today largely on the You Call This Art, Greg Irons retrospective book that was published by Fantagraphics, I think, which is now like absolutely impossible to get hold of in hard copy. It's like $600 in hard copy.
Anytime Matt mentions one of these books, I immediately look at how expensive it is. But like his stuff, it very much felt like I was seeing a missing piece of a puzzle. Because obviously,
so that's interesting.
Like your knowledge of the continuity of tattoo history as art history is much more solid than mine, but it kind of really fit in between the traditional stuff and the Japanese stuff that was going on in the 60s and the 70s, and then kind of the stuff when you get into the 90s, the real like gnarly fantasy stuff that is like a small bit of a holdover of the 90s or of the 80s, that's kind of being referenced now by quite a lot of artists. If you look at someone like Sammy Hellride, who does a lot of my tattoos, he's pulling quite heavily from Irons' stuff, and it just really slotted in with the idea of like high fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, psychedelia, kind of what happens when the acid trip goes bad type of tattooing.
That's such an interesting way of putting it, and I literally hadn't thought about that, because he literally bridges those worlds, right? Like he grew up in the psychedelic 60s, watched the Summer of Love go bad and turn into Vietnam and the post-war consensus rot, and become the 70s, like become the racially divided dropout culture of the late 70s. And then gets into tattooing in early 80s and brings with him this kind of fantasy hippie kind of vibe with all that cynicism and humor and anger and frustration, and all these drawings he'd been doing of like for kids' coloring books to pay the bills.
Yeah, and like it, but it's really interesting in the continuity of art, like going into the 70s. And I recently was on another podcast talking about the punk movement in the mid to late 70s, and that like this kind of cultural nihilism that's set in when you saw that the 60s didn't bring about the revolution either socially or politically as people spouted it would. And it's kind of like, well, none of this stuff came to pass. There's nothing left. It's kind of like you're staring down the barrel of the end of the world.
Yeah, and I teach a lot about this in my standard art history class, this moment of time, right? Because and there's which maybe we'll get into later on, there's also a really interesting reason or a set of reasons to think about why this movement, some of them became super crazy right wing, like libertarians.
Well, actually, I on that episode, I have a pet theory that is there is like two sides of the coin when you have cultural movements like that. You have people who are revolutionaries versus reactionaries, and it's like if you have no actual like political underpinning to your rebellion against whatever you're rebelling against, you are just a reactionary. You're just reacting to everything that's around you rather than here is a coherent political ideology, or not even ideology, but like train of thought that is supporting your actions.
Yeah, and this is a period, mid 60s, certainly by the time we get to 68, 69 with Stonewall and with May 68 in France, the student riots and all of the youth rebellion movements from everywhere from Mexico to Prague, all of which are basically young generations frustrated that the promise as they saw it of World War II and the New World Order, the global consensus that had arrived, and the promises that they were made just basically went to shit with the rise of neoliberalism and globalism. So yeah, I hadn't thought about that way before, but Irons' arc traces that pretty much exactly, really. So maybe I'll start actually before we read his biography. I want to read you this little quote about him from Hardy's book, Where Your Dreams. This is about 1979, I think. Sorry, Doug. I'll correct this later on in the episode if I get it wrong. Don't email me just yet. Greg was a genius from the underground cartoon scene. His Yellow Dogs comics rank with Crumb's Zap comics as a classic of the era. He lived in London as worked as an art slave on the Beatles animated movie Yellow Submarine. He drew psychedelic posters for the Fillmore Auditorium and album covers for the Jefferson Airplane. He was a terrifically talented artist and was living on peanuts, and decided to teach himself to tattoo after Airplane guitarist Jorma Kaukonen told him what he paid for his tattoo work.
But it is perfectly that kind of pathway of working as an art slave on Yellow Submarine, like the Beatles, the epitome of the hippie movement.
Right. So Hardy goes on to say, Bob Roberts and I met Greg long before he segued into tattoos. And when he did, he became famous faster than anybody ever had in this business. He had a unique graphic style fresh to tattooing. My work was primarily about introducing new imagery, expanding the medium, making it more painterly, opening up to more expressive visions. But Irons came out with a strong, instant identifiable graphic style all of his own. I'll return to that later on, but that's basically kind of a good intro. That he became famous in the tattoo scene more than ever, but to get famous otherwise was a slow process. So he was born in 1947, and his family moved to Philadelphia in 1957 when he was 10 years old. And like his brother and people that knew him at the time and his family described that like from a very, very young age, he's starting to like do cartoons and to do comics and to do stuff that was funny. He also like clearly obviously had a kind of dark side. Like there's this story right in the beginning of the Rosencrantz book where he was deeply afraid of being carried off or killed by some maniac. One of his friends said, we came from a long line of dark characters, 3 alcoholic uncles, 1 suicide, all kinds of gothic stuff. Greg and I referred to it as the Irons curse, right? So he has this kind of darkness, but also this humor. He made friends easily, says his brother, but there was a streak of mean-spiritedness there, and that comes across a lot in his work too. He had a real biting, satirical sense of humor. His parents told him to bring his grades up or else, but he was too cool for school. Cigarettes, booze, and party girls became extracurricular activities. He gets sent to military school for a year to try and straighten up, and as you imagine, that doesn't go so well. But it did kind of give him this philosophical awakening. So he realized that, oh shit, right, I'm here now. This means I'm going to end up going to Vietnam, right? This is real now.
Yep.
This shit is real. He was first tattooed in the early 60s, I think. Mid 60s. with the word tattoo.
Very meta.
Yeah, which became infected the day after he got it.
even more meta.
Exactly. So this is like, there's this poetry in his biography. When a friend from the old neighborhood came home from the war, he looked Greg up. He told Greg about being a point man in Vietnam where he had to crawl ahead of the rest of the guys, and the Viet Cong came along and he was out of the bushes and these guys stepped right over him. When he came back from Vietnam, he developed colitis from post-traumatic stress. He held it all together all the way through, but when he got home, he had acute diarrhea for months and was completely fucked up. He was Greg's best friend when they were 7 in the old neighborhood. And so, yeah, Greg was just like, I'm going to end up having to go to Vietnam.
Yep.
And I don't think he actually does end up going to Vietnam, but he's clearly aware that it's fucking possible, right? Like, it's imminent. And he realizes he's got nothing going in his life. He dropped out of high school. And he realized that, like, yeah, he was going to have to, like, deal with the fact that this country he was in and this place he was in and the world that he was in all of a sudden had all this complexity and danger and horror in it that he didn't want to be part of. And I think, there's this kind of, again, discussion in the first section of the book, in Rosencrantz's book, where his brother's basically like, look, it was like the fear of going to Vietnam or the context of the world around him.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, like we mentioned it earlier, and drawing a comparison between him and Crumb, because like both of them in their comics work portray like a real like nasty, mean world, but portrayed it in like very different ways. And like you can see, like with Crumb, it's kind of this perverse disgust, but also attraction to the darkness. Whereas like with Iron's comics, it seems very much like this is, a nastiness and a darkness born out of like fear, like genuinely being like the world is about to fall apart. Whereas like Crumb is like, oh, the world's about to fall apart. Let me roll around in the dust and the debris.
Yeah, and there's also this kind of interesting, like, intergenerational thing where like all the parents' generation have gone to World War II, or been in the Korean War. In some cases, people that are young parents, and like they're like, how did I give birth to these hippies? Who are you? Who are these kids that are like, fuck authority and burning their draft cards and, coming up with, getting interested in Eastern mysticism, and like there's this, that's this kind of birth of the moral panic in some senses about teenagers as well, as well as this kind of confrontational relationship that the kids have with their culture. They also have it with their own families, right?
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting point to be drawn as well between the episode we did about the history of pinups, when we look at like Elverin's pinups and the post-war promise of wealth, security, fulfillment, and the hippies kind of questioned a lot of that, and the fallout of it. It was like the hippies, they didn't solve anything, but they like very aptly exposed the hollowness at the heart of the post-war promise. And that's where I think you have someone like Irons' art being a very, because as well, like in his comics work and his tattoos, he stands apart very starkly from most other tattoo artists at the time as well.
Yeah, and his work's much more, I guess we'll talk about, certainly his comic work is much more self-loathing than Crumb's. I mean, there's some of that in Crumb, but Crumb is much more obviously satirical. There's lots of like personal darkness in Crumb's comics, particularly in this kind of self-portrait avatar character, this monkey character that he creates that we'll cover to later on. There's just, that you get the feeling that Greg's trying to work some shit out. He's figuring out stuff so much that he finds a kind of anti-war group in Philadelphia where he's at art school, and they put him in touch with a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist writes a letter saying this guy's like crazy, he's unfit for military service, you don't want him in your unit. Right. So yeah, Irons then wrote again, I'm quoting from Rosencrantz here. He wrote a personal letter to the commander of the American forces, explained his opposition to the war, and said he was leaving town. As soon as that was over, I realized I could do anything I want. So he'd been in college doing art. He'd been in a band called Cat's Cradle, doing sort of a little bit of poster work to pay the bills. He'd smoking a lot of weed, dropping a lot of acid because it's like the early days of like experimental acid. Just kind of living the kind of movie version of what you imagine the 1960s art school life was. Not yet in California, but obviously you can see why he's ending up in fucking San Francisco, because like that's the center of the world at the time. I mean, do you want to describe? Okay, I'm gonna so we can go through this. I'm gonna describe. We can go through his art. I'll share my screen so you can see what I'm looking at. So this is one of his early San Francisco posters for a headline act called Dave Van Ronk.
Oh yeah, Dave Van Ronk.
Hear the Seers in concert.
Most importantly, Fred Neil is on that poster.
Yeah,
Fred Neil, the greatest singer-songwriter that history forgot. Personal favorite of mine. But it's like, what if you gave Beardsley like a bad acid trip?
Yeah, it's like he's clearly influenced by kind of Art Nouveau and by like psychedelia. Like Beardsley, a huge influence. You see a lot of this coming up through 60s folk art, sort of neo-pagan stuff in this period. Like it's quite nostalgic in a way, but with this absolute dark, this is a kind of wizard sort of crystal ball reading.
Yeah, it's like a carnival fortune teller with Western expansion caravan parade underneath it, but like everything is kind of like dissipating. Look, when you take a lot of drugs, you understand stuff like this.
Absolutely.
Look, I get where he's coming from.
So he actually gets to San Francisco in '67, and the Summer of Love, the famous one, had happened the year before. So already this is a scene that's in kind of, it's already becoming a bit more commercialized, and it's becoming like, its own thing. But right there, he's again doing all this incredible poster work. Again, like based in a kind of Victorian romanticism. Like this is a poster for an event which was called Alice's Mad Tea Party, where it looks like, the whole Alice in Wonderland crew are doing amphetamines or something, or doing weed. You've got these, even for things like Chuck Berry, right, and the animals, you've got these weird Victorian Art Nouveau 2-color screen prints, just absolutely freaking incredible graphic. Like, people would have seen this kind of style before, and he's not the originator of it, but he's clearly someone whose style is pushing this kind of stuff, like right at the heart of the the height of it. But yeah, it starts to get dirtier, right? It starts to get, as the world gets darker, as the war in Vietnam rolls on, and as things roll out, like he sours, I think, right?
Yeah, and like for those who aren't really familiar, like part of the reason why the Vietnam War was so shocking in the popular consciousness is that it was the first large-scale warfare where it was just broadcast on the news every night for years. Like it was funny because I talked to someone who listens to another show that I work on, and we were talking about what it was like being a kid seeing the Vietnam War on TV every day, and he was like, it kind of just like warped your perception of reality around like grotesqueness and violence, because you were like 10 years old seeing dead bodies on TV all the time.
Yeah, and also that it brings with it all of the Red Scare about communism and about ideology. It's the Cold War as well, so there's all this kind of clash of civilization stuff. Like it's a very strange time to grow up.
Hmm. And also but also like the literary and musical fascination with like this being the end of the world. Like we are about to see the destruction of everything, and I think like in especially in his comics, like he translates that kind of grotesqueness and the fatality of how it must have felt to be alive at the time into art like really really well.
Yeah, and I think also, even this period, he goes to London, right? Because he's a big fan of the Beatles, like all those American hippies were. He does a kind of poster for based on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. He designs he paints a picture for that he intends to give to John Lennon based on I Am the Walrus, but they never met. But then like he goes to work on the Yellow Submarine film, which is great for him because it's a paying gig and very exciting and cool because the Beatles, right? But he writes this like note back to his parents for Christmas 1967. He calls himself an art slave, and he says, "Having a wonderful wish you were here in crummy England. Only green I've seen is in the complexions. Being a starving artist in Europe keeps me starving. Thanks for the Christmas pudding, which his parents must send him. It always comes when most needed. Had terrible, depressing, horrible, grey Christmas. Ho ho ho. Somehow I like England though." That's to his grandparents. So you can get the sense that even this kind of thing that he's really excited about is a bit darker and weirder than he wants, but he does seem to like it. And he's doing a fuckload of acid at the time.
Yep. I understand that.
The other interesting thing I think is this that's interesting at this time is he's crossing because he hasn't got very much money. He's not flying by aeroplane. He's crossing the Atlantic on a boat, and he starts painting like ships and particularly dragons at the time. So do you want to just describe, because this also becomes a bit of a, as we'll explore in the tattoo work, becomes a bit of a leitmotif in his work. So do you want to describe this? Like, so that, again, if people are looking for like good ideas for flash or tattoos to get, you can get this Rosencrantz book on Amazon in ebook. As I said, the hardback is basically impossible to get hold of for anything under about $400-$500 if you're lucky. But the ebook is available for like £7-8 on Amazon, so you can get it. You can read this book. You just can't buy a hard copy of it. How fucking good would this be as a design? This dragon guy. Yeah. So what do you make of this little dragon, Thomas?
It's so cool. Like like he's at sea, so obviously he's like thinking about this stuff. But it's just, it's so cool. Like it's much closer to nautical maps from like the 18th century than like anything that's because like everyone is trying to do like Japanese dragons or Chinese dragons, whereas he's like looking at the corners of nautical maps and drawing inspiration from there. And it makes sense that he will eventually make his mark as like a fantasy artist.
Right. Yeah. And as a tattooer, right? Because his line work, because he ends up working, and this is what we'll go on to next, because he ends up working in comics. And I guess because he trained as a poster artist, like because he trained in this like silkscreen tradition, he's learning to do like bold line work and stuff that the stuff that just is really graphic, readable from a distance, funny, dark, like all the things we talked about. Even when we talked about the pinups and on our episodes about images that work in these mediums also lend themselves very nicely to tattoos. So look, he gets back to San Francisco in '69, and like posters and hippie music isn't very cool anymore. Comics are cool, right? So he can't make his living doing posters anymore, but he ends up basically working for a series of comics like into 1970s, including famously like Yellow Dog. He tried to submit stuff originally to Zap, which was Crumbs and Spain Rodriguez's Robert Williams's comic, but his stuff for various reasons didn't end up getting published in Zap. So a different publisher published it in Yellow Dog. And this is like exactly this period of like the documenting this time of like things going bad. So like biker gangs who are themselves often veterans from Vietnam who were disaffected for various reasons. Some of them much more, who thought the government wasn't right wing enough. Some of them thought it wasn't left wing enough. Like
some of them didn't want any government at all.
Some of them didn't want any government at all. So again, like I just think it's useful for you, for the listeners to hear your descriptions of these. But like, this is really nice. This is a comic he did for a comic called Heavy in 1969. Can you describe to listeners like this fucking comic, particularly this fucking what's happening at the top? Oh.
Yeah, so it's like it is a man carrying a gigantic overweight woman on his back with a kind of mutant zombie.
It's not just a woman, it's the Statue of Liberty.
So it's an overweight Statue of Liberty with a rotting zombie Uncle Sam stabbing her in the heart with a flagpole.
Yeah, being carried by some kind of like working or young buck. Like, just this sums up what's going on politically, basically. Like, and I'm amazed at how like that kind of badass single-eyed popping skull zombie Uncle Sam, like painted in 69, but feels to me like something that could have come out in the 1980s or the 90s.
Yeah, it's very Ratfink.
Very Ratfink. I mean, of course, that's the same scene in a way, right? Like that's that scene with Ed Roth is around at the same time. So he also then starts doing these like satirical comics about the war in Vietnam. These absolutely like horrific, hard hitting satires, satirizing war comics, the kind of things that Roy Lichtenstein from the 40s. Who by the 60s had made into these big parodies.
I am so bored of Liechtenstein. It's just such absolute hack.
Yeah, I have a slightly more nuanced take on it, as you may expect, but I think that's not an unreasonable take. But like,
he is the Jeff Koons of anti-war art.
But the things that Lichtenstein, I mean, like for example, like very specifically, if you go on page 48, Tom, like very specifically, the comics that Lichtenstein was appropriating about a decade earlier than Irons, or half a decade earlier, to do these kind of satires of the pop culture of war. Like Irons is, I think, directly engaging with, but in a much fucking more dark way, including showing photos of people blown up, 47, 48, 49, with literally their penises like blown up and this absolute kind of, the reality of the horrors of war.
Rendered from breast to bollocks.
Exactly. Which then becomes his work for like subcultural, anti-war, countercultural magazines like the Berkeley Tribe, doing amazing kind of posters for strike organizing. I've just bought a couple of these. They're fairly easy to track down, actually. But again, as you imagine, that's not paying the bills very well. Working doing drawings for countercultural magazines isn't really paying the bills. And yeah, carries on, then finds himself working for Jefferson Airplane. We mentioned this at the beginning. So Jefferson Airplane, he's traveling with them. He's doing posters for them, for Grateful Dead, which also pays the bills. And then also stuff that's a bit more mainstream. So like horror comics and sci-fi comics, things like Slow Death, which is like one of my favorites. Absolutely freaking mad, political, sci-fi, weird shit. Again, which is like zombies and caricatures of Reagan and like, again, loads of weird nautical stuff.
And like it's interesting as well because like in a very roundabout way, like it's kind of influential on Raymond Pettibon. Like
100%, 100%, yeah. 100%.
Like this kind of gross out political like art. It's satire as well. You can see like if you took away probably about 90% of the line work, you get Raymond Pettibon.
Yeah, but they're also inspired by the same things as well, right? All of this stuff is in a conversation with each other. Like you can see where Ed Roth, who you mentioned, and even Ed Hardy and Tattooer, they're all inspired by the same political and graphic environment, particularly in the place, on the west coast of the United States, which leads to all this stuff looking very, very similar in a way and intersecting.
Yeah, and it's funny because someone someone said to me before, is like, oh, the reason why everything is political in California is because it's because that's what happened when you don't give people any weather to complain about.
That's a really good point. And I think it's interesting, like basically at the same time as he's doing all these weird, gross out political comics, he's also paying the bills by doing coloring in books. Again, which you can track down, like of dinosaurs. If any tattooers online are looking for good reference, just like get all the old Greg Irons coloring books because you can pick them up, most of them pretty cheaply. There's one that's the Wife of Bath, like an illustrated version of the Chaucer story. There's one of Old English pub signs, which I haven't been able to find yet. There's this one of the American Revolution. Like all of these just fucking crazy books of line work that, again, you can really see why his work's going to work for tattooing. And they point out in the book at the same time, like he does this series of line book drawings of like a kid's book about pirates at the same time as doing allegories of like the United States as this pirate like plundering and raping its way through the world as a neo-colonial power. Like these things exist artistically in his oeuvre at the same time. The thing I sent you a lot of, and you can find a PDF of this online, was his Dungeons and Dragons coloring in book.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at it right now.
The Advanced Dungeons and Dragons coloring album from 1978 on Troubadour Press, which is written by Gary Gygax, The Adventure of Dungeons and Dragons, which comes with a new kind of campaign and all this kind of stuff. But he's also just full of like designs where I was just like, Tom, this should be your back piece designs.
But like also like includes, little subtle things that like Irons is doing throughout his career. Like his monkey character is in one of the panels.
Yeah. I want to come to Gregor in a minute. Yeah. But like, I mean, you talked about. I'm going to try and open up the actual. I haven't got the whole coloring book opened up yet. But you talked about him being this connection, right? This connection between in tattooing the 70s or the 60s kind of traditional stuff to the 70s and 80s neo mystic wizardy shit. Can you talk about some of the wizardy shit in this? Because I think that's what I was sending you about being. You can compare it with his later flash sheets from 6 or 7 years later, and not even 6 or 7, like 3 or 4 years later, which is full of kind of wizard flash designs, at least on one of the sheets. Can you again, because you love this stuff, like you were rocking out when it was.
It's kind of hard to like talk about it because like at the time that this stuff is coming out, it's when the kind of visual language for high fantasy stuff is being developed outside of, Tolkien and that kind of early high fantasy. And it's like skeleton wizards with like crowns made of bones wearing tattered cloaks. And you have like, it's just, and you have like, like knights in like big cloaks and chainmail and like with feathers in their helmets. It's like if you have ever done any dungeon mission in Skyrim, you've like seen a lot of this stuff, and it's like it's so interesting, like how much like this is so influential on character design in contemporary fantasy stuff to this day.
Well, for example, have you actually got the coloring book open in front of you?
Yeah. The link is in the chat.
So page 13, I got it open. Page 13. What does that big one-eyed freaking? I'm not a Dungeons and Dragons nerd particularly. What is that big, crazy, single-eyed floating monster? What does that remind you
Oh,
of?
that is a it's a Capra Demon from Doom.
Exactly. Is that's
Yeah,
exactly what is referenced in in Doom,
yeah, yeah.
right? Um, and just absolute, ready to go flash for anyone that wants to do some cool monkeys and demons and witches and kind of monstrous shit. You could just slap this straight on. There's an amazing sheet of like a height of a like 5 or 6 headed dragon. Just absolutely incredible. And you can see how, the kids who are coloring this shit in when they're 10, 11, you can see why they want to get it tattooed 10 years later.
Yeah, see, this is what the 90s were great. Everyone's parents were divorced. You spent your childhood in the 80s coloring this shit in, and then you just become like an insane tattoo artist or a comics artist or a game designer, and everyone's just pulling from this exact same stuff.
Yeah. And and again, like, to belabor this point, but at the same time as he's doing these books for Gary Gygax and coloring in books for children, he's also producing comics about like nuclear war and pollution. He did a strip in Slow Death called Corporate Cancer about the ADA. Mm-hmm. Like, I reckon he'd be a freaking anti-vaxxer.
Oh, 100%. Like, they put like Robert Crumb was an
Yeah.
anti-vaxxer. Like it is
one of these
like
kind of left-wing. You see this happen. You can see how a lot of these guys that were really kind of counterculture and angry for principled reasons against the healthcare industry.
They just turn into Nick Land.
Yeah, although I think Nick Land's. No, I'm not defending Nick Land. But I think his journey's slightly different. To be honest with you, I think Nick Land is coming from a slightly different place, and Nick Land's younger than Greg Irons was as well. But like, yeah, the general point is the same. It is basically this kind of principled anger and skepticism against the military-industrial pharmaceutical complex.
But these it makes sense though. He's come through the post-war period, and the promise of a safe and secure government, a secure future, has fallen apart, and the promise of like this social and political grassroots revolution didn't come to pass. So you're staring, across the Bering Strait at Russia pointing nukes at you, and you're pointing nukes at them, and it's like of course everything's going to get dark, and you're going to be like, well, all of these people have led us to this situation. Why shouldn't I be skeptical of them?
Yeah, and he's not wrong. I mean, there's an amazing bit. So people can track this down, and so you can find the book. He does this series of called Corporate Cancer, which talks about basically resource extraction and abuse of indigenous peoples in the Americas, and about the food industry and the vitamin industry and all this stuff. But he does this whole list of like facts about the medical industrial complex, and at the end of that, he says, look, it's important to note many doctors are not inept greenheads. The point is that the system that produces and in many ways controls MDs is a hideous monster incapable of meeting the needs of the populace. Some MDs I know seem to be genuinely motivated by a desire to alleviate human suffering. They appear to be great technicians, even my dentist. Hell of a nice guy. Seems to be genuinely dedicated to teeth. On the other hand, maybe it's his fetish. And if anyone's watched the dramatizations documentaries recently about the opioid crisis in the 90s, you'll know how deep that stuff runs in American medical culture. So he's not wrong, but I'm just sort of saying lots of people from his community ended up being the Robert Kennedy Jr. essentially. So let's talk about Gregor, and then we'll finish up by talking about the tattooing. So Gregor's super interesting. I've got some original Wertham's comics, which is one of the comics he did with Gregor, the Gregor strips in. So on the first cover of Dr. Wertham's Comics and Stories, 1978, and this is hanging on this is the image on page 221 for you, Tom. I've got the original of this hanging on my wall because it's such a. it's such a good illustration of like, again, he trained in art school. He would have learned, he was around kind of art school types. He would have learned the kind of about Freudian theories of psychoanalysis and the collective unconscious. So this is called Tales Dredged from the Depths of the Collective Unconscious. So it's a very kind of literate and intelligent and, you know, zeitgeisty take on the relationship between the psychosexual and the artistic. And he's drawn here this self-portrait basically of himself painting a nude model in this sort of dirty studio with some rock and roll playing on the radio. And she says, I hope you're planning on paying me in cash. And he says, the artist transcends the gross materialist plane. And then in the mirror next to him, he's reflected not as himself, but as this figure, this monkey figure called Gregor, where in the mirror, the speech bubble says backwards, I'm just a dirty little monkey and I'm totally out of control. In fact, you know, other people that write about him have talked about him do talk about, you know, he liked to party. He had sex with sex workers. He clearly had a kind of like sexual attraction to teenagers, let's put it that way. This comes up a bit in you know, in the Gregor stories. If we take Gregor, I mean, I don't think he's you know, actually openly doing that, but like he's clearly kind of wrestling with this part of his unconscious that's perverted and weird and driven and suppressed by drugs.
I mean, it's like very clear throughout like all of his work, even from the like late 60s, that he uses his art as an almost one-to-one like way to work through like stuff, like how to externalize stuff in his mind.
Yeah, and like, you know, so there's a strip from a magazine called Young Lust, comic number 6 from 1980, called Monkey Lust, and this actually features like the Gregor character, like just absolutely like debauched, trying to pick up women, but realizing it's like, you know, it's gonna be the death of him in a way. It's gonna be this absolute kind of darkness. Gregor, this monkey is like smoking, doing cocaine, riding a motorbike, like having weird, disgusting, self-loathing sex, getting tattooed, interestingly enough, and getting beaten up in a tattoo studio, and just kind of trying to deal with that part of not just him, but a part of the collective unconscious of American cinema and popular culture, right?
It kind of accurately captures the kind of infatuation and consequences with oblivion that comes with being someone who is at the very far precipice of both your mind, addiction, sex. It's kind of like, in a way, and like, not to be constantly drawing connections between him and Crumb, in the way that Crumb tries to feel out those furthest edges of both good and bad taste in terms of like sexual perversion. Like Irons is really like pushing the extremity of like self-destruction and what that actually means.
Yeah, and it's not celebratory of it either, right? Like no, it's kind of disgusted.
Yeah, and like that would actually be the big divergent point between like him and Crumb. Is like Crumb kind of like giggles and like relishes in the kind of disgusting perversion, whereas like Irons very much seems just as disgusted with it as you, the reader, should be.
Yeah, and there's a cover of one of the magazines where Gregor's like cut his ear off like Van Gogh, and then has, you know, Gregor is having a terrible time, they tell me. Gregor's unhappy. He's in love with a wholesome young girl. He's finding it painful. Amazingly, she seems to love him, but she's too domestic. He can't handle it. Gregor has driven her away in tears and confusion. He wants cake. He wants to eat it too. More pussy, more drugs, more everything. He wants to fuck Farrah Fawcett in the ass. His latest kick is weightlifting. Arnold says the pain means muscles are growing, right? Like, he's disgusted, he's ashamed, he is angry, he's doing too much cocaine. The character, and we can sort of take this as, as kind of, I think, an avatar of sorts. He goes to get tattooed, and in fact, one of the characters in the tattoo strip says, "We ain't heard from Gregor for a while. He's abandoned the big time in pursuit of fine art." Right, coming back to fucking fine art. But where it ends up, is this kind of self-destructive, kind of dark, ashamed place, which I find is very, very interesting, but done with humor and satire and self-awareness as well. It's sad and lonely. It's a sad and lonely battle, Gregor, and no one even cares. Life is like a cigarette. Some burnt it like a torch, others savor it. So worth reading. And I think, it's around that time, or in that moment, in about 1980, 81, that he also finds his way to tattooing. So in a way, it seems like tattooing is something of a I don't know, release for him. Is that worth saying? He sort of, you can see his tattooing and his life, and there's lots in the book and in articles about him, and in Ed's telling that I read some of already. He's clearly becoming very excited about tattooing in quite a positive way. Not only because it pays the bills, but it's also, it's something exciting.
Yeah, I think it's like a little bit of a sojourn from, the darkness of the comics, because it almost comes across like he's been trapped by his own art at that stage, and it's a kind of new medium that he can work with. And it seems like he kind of thrived whenever he was given a new medium, whether it was moving from poster illustration to comic books to doing coloring books. This is something new he can sink his teeth into, and it's I think all artists kind of thrive when you give them something new to do.
Yeah, and it's, as I said, the sort of the general description of it is that he realizes this is a way to pay the bills, sent that way by Kakunen from Jefferson Airplane, but and Jefferson Starship. But Greg instantly starts to connect into the tattoo universe. He meets Ed Hardy. He meets Chuck Eldridge, who now runs the Tattoo Archive. He works for he works for Henry Goldfield, who's in Modern Primitives as a tattooer. He very very quickly just is excited about tattooing, excited about the tattoo world. It's new. He's meeting people. Chuck Eldridge basically describes as well, quote, in 1980, "We met at a tattoo shop in Broadway in San Francisco, and Greg, had just been hired at Dean's tattoo headquarters. Dean Dennis always owning a shop in San Francisco, so we found a place on Broadway between the Mystic Eye and the Tibet shop. It was a good location, so we rented that, and I helped him build it. Ed Nolte, who was a San Francisco silk screener, knew Greg and knew Greg wanted to get into tattooing. So Dean hired Greg on the spot for the midnight shift. We were all completely shocked at what we got, and his second tattoo was better than what some people had done after 10 years. His techniques went through the ceiling immediately. Within 3 months, he was a consistently good tattooer. Tattooers would fly to San Francisco to get tattooed by him. Getting a tattoo from him is like paying for an art lesson. That's why everyone wanted it on their legs or their arms or their stomachs, because they could watch him work and try and figure out how he did it. I think probably the biggest compliment Greg could ever be paid by the tattoo world. So he became, this absolute kind of legend, even though he was tattooing at bloody midnight. He said after the bars closed, everything shut down. He understood he needed to do a lot of tattoos. He needed a lot of skin. His thing was down pat, but his art thing was down pat. But he had to learn how to translate that into a tattoo using this weird vibrating machine. It wasn't a nice paintbrush with pure black anymore. He understood that, so he slammed. He tattooed dusk till dawn. He'd have them lined up. He stopped for espresso and one break, and that would be it. He'd tattoo and tattoo and tattoo. And Ed Hardy describes him actually doing coffee and weed. So what was called a weed ball, right? And just powering through. Chuck goes on to say he saw the big picture. he saw that he could become a celebrity and star in the tattoo industry. Kakkonen said he created negative space by using mass and concentration. And in 1980, a friend, Greg wrote to a friend in Boston, I got a job in a tattoo shop, got a couple of machines made by a 76-year-old guy from Florida. I'm getting pretty good pretty fast. There's a lot to learn, I tell you. So he's humble, but he's excited, right? And by this point, he's like mid-30s, right? So this is like 1980. He was born in 1947. He's got this like nightlife, so he's tattooing sailors and soldiers, but also hippies and it's strip joints and nightclubs, and it's like perfect place for him. And again, on page 257, Tom, like look at some of his early flash. Who's he inspired by? Thanks to Vargas and Petty.
Yep. No, it's like his stuff is just so cool. Like it, it feels so unique at the time as well. Like early 80s, like it doesn't seem like anyone was doing this stuff.
Yeah.
Like even when you kind of like go forward and like look at like the actual tattoos, like they're, I don't know, it's just it's kind of invigorating to see something that is like different.
Yeah, and his stuff looks like it looks very different from, as you said, what everyone else is doing. It looks like what comes next because he starts selling flash, and his style gets picked up all over the world by, through the changing of flash, and as his legend grows, and so he sort of is part of what becomes new school in the 90s, right? So he moves to Seattle. He hooks back up with an old girlfriend of his that he'd first met years earlier, this woman called Lynn Saraguchi. And they moved to Seattle to tattoo there. And yeah, is writing to Hardy, like in a constant kind of correspondence with Hardy, coming back to San Francisco, painting flyers for other people. His script is also like really, really influential. Like he drew designs for Hardy at Realistic. He did, as I said, flyers for Dancehall in Seattle where he was working. He did flyers for Goldfield. Like he was also designing a lot of fucking business cards for people and shops that he worked or guested in, which is also just absolutely iconic, right? And yeah, just is like doing pretty well. Really kind of bashing out. And then he has a bit of a setback because he has a bike accident. He's testing out a new bike and gets hit by a car. He that also kind of busted his face up a bit, and he got an insurance settlement, but like didn't want to have plastic surgery to repair his face because he said like. And this is an amazing quote as well, right? Like he thought he'd gained a face to match how he thought he should look, right? Super interesting. Yeah, and then becomes this absolute face of tattoo. And he came to tattoo convention, so he came to the UK in the early 80s, went back to work for Goldfield, was just really becoming this absolute like legend in the industry. However, that caused problems. He'd often visit prostitutes and sex workers while he was abroad. His partner, Lynn Saraguchi, said he went on a lot of trips. That was one of the reasons we had problems. He compartmentalized different parts of his life. When I got to see him in hospital, when he went to Amsterdam, I wanted to come too. When I got there, I found out he'd gone to prostitutes. So I had to complete with, again, pardon the language here, but this is a quote, skanky old whores giving him blowjobs. It hurt me so badly. He was good at hiding his feelings. I think that must relate somehow to going to prostitutes, non-personalized sexual release. In the journal entry I read, which I found in Belgium, he wrote of going twice to a prostitute who looked like Lynn, only with bigger tits. And 2 sentences later, I love Lynn so much. Like,
man's got complex problems.
Got complex issues, right? And again, according to Lynn, like this is just kind of, he was reckless, he was self-destructive, but he also cared. He also gave a shit about tattooing. And yeah, it was a sort of tattoo trip, or a moment of tattooing, which really completes his story, unfortunately. So he'd gone on a trip out to Southeast Asia. Yeah, he went to Tokyo first. He met up with Dr. Fukushi, or the Fukushis for Hardy in Tokyo. And while he was there, he went and got tattooed. So he went to Chiang Mai and negotiated a tattoo from a Buddhist monk, the image of a snake, which was supposed to be a protective talisman. However, according to his brother Mark, in Thai culture, the snake is one of their symbols for death. A week later, on the day he was leaving the country, he was struck down by a city bus in the streets of Bangkok. So he basically crossed the road, and there was a bus lane, where traffic was coming that direction. He was looking the wrong way. And he was hit by a bus and died clearly very quickly. And it's very sad, because he was writing both to Lynn, both to another woman who he would work with on an illustration project called Anne Moen. Having a swell time, words cannot express the adrenaline rush produced by crushing hordes, combined with Southeast Asian heat and humidity. And he signed that as Gregor. He wrote to Lynn, back to Hawaii soon. Hope I'll see you before you get this card. But anyway, I love you. And pats to the doggies. He wrote to Pekka Kakkonen from Jefferson Airplane, and he wrote to Henry Goldfield. Super excited by this tattooing, but yeah, like, passed away, and left behind this legacy and this promise ahead of him, right? Like, in 30th of November 1984. Really sadly for me as well, in the book they republished this list, one-page sketchbook, and it says by 1987. So he's put this together, chatting out his life, like what he's done. So printing, comics, what I want to do. And then he says, by mid-84, return to Europe, world traveler's tattooist, big time travels, big time ideas, big time tattooing, big time breaks, big time. Like, he was really pumped. And the caption to that in Rosencrantz's book says, it all looks so coherent in retrospect as he moved boldly forward through the years, but it wasn't like that. This simple diagram represents years of struggle, of rage, of misgivings, dashed hopes and new dreams. The last entry looks forward to the future. Fate didn't see it that way. And I think, yeah, for me, like, again, we can think about, what kind of man, what kind of tattooer Greg Irons would have become, but he was tattooing for basically like 6 years, from like 79 to like 84, and as you said, like, became this absolute legend, and produced a series of flash sheets and a series of designs and a series of things which just became absolutely iconic. And yeah, like, joined up the dots. His last flash sheets they look like kind of what we would go in school call new school stuff, right? It's like, it's wizards and dragons, but with some old school stuff and with some Japanese inspired Orientalist stuff, and with the sort of tribal dragon thing that Sick of It All used for their logo, and with weird, like, just very kind of like of its time stuff that a whole generation of tattooers after him took on and developed and changed, but which would have been so interesting to see what would have become, right?
Yeah, like I said earlier, to me, it just, like, it instantly struck me as that he is part of the missing piece of the puzzle that joins up between the old school traditional stuff and, like you said, new school, like the stuff that was the future.
Yeah, exactly. And again, to what degree he predicted it, what degree he created it, and what degree he came alongside it is a a much more technical art historical question we've got space for here, but if you're looking, I mean, even like, and this is maybe a place I want to finish, like, if you look at the drawing from, he did an illustrated series of prints for the Samuel Taylor Coleridge Rime of the Ancient Mariner in 1981, and like, if you look at, like, for example, the page on page 290, like, there's this like black work, negative space, brutal stuff that like really innovative tattooers are doing now, and one wonders if he'd have been pushing weird black work stuff and been pushing super cool graphic stuff as well as all this other possibility. You know, there's stuff in his brief career that if you're into like Japanese stuff, you'll get excited about. If you're into black and grey and like that kind of stuff, you'll be into. If you're into 80s stuff, you'll be into it. If you're into new school, you'll be into that. If you're into crazy contemporary black work, you'll be into that. Like, he seems to be one of these nexus points, these kind of filter points for everything that was happening before and after him. And it's yeah, we lost him too soon. Super, and I'm pleased to have brought him to your attention, Tom.
Yeah, he fucking rocks. I like it. Yeah, like at the back of the book, those, like, you know, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it kind of, it's interesting how even as he transitioned mediums, like, he was still just like both keeping a stride and ahead of the game in like illustration for comics, and yeah, like the candle that burns twice as bright lasts half as long.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. Maybe we'll finish this with, this is a good place to finish this quote. This is from Ed Hardy again. Greg was a great tattooer. He had a distinct style. He kept developing his talent and had a huge international reputation, which was well deserved. If he'd kept working, he'd be right up there today in the upper echelon of the tattoo world. He worked quickly and efficiently. He could make thick or thin lines. He worked very long hours and had a great work ethic. He had a great style. He was Greg Irons. He had a great rapport with his customers. That's what it takes. You have to be able to communicate and relate to people. There are some people who do great work, but they're arseholes who can't relate to people. Greg was a great guy.
Yeah, so I think that's where we're going to end it. I don't really have anything to add on to it.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this episode, I know it's been a lot longer than our normal episodes. Thank you so much. It's kind of, we had so much stuff to talk about, particularly because he's an artist that, you know, isn't as recognized as he kind of should be. But I want to thank all of you for supporting the show. Remember, if you subscribe at the £10 or above tier, you get a thank you shout out at the end of the episode. So I want to thank Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Shit Jesus, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, Jordan Best, Jess Goodman, James Schick, and Charlie Lightning. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
If you haven't already, check us out on Instagram. We're doing a lot of stuff over there. I am, like I said, trawling YouTube to try and find interesting stuff that people mightn't have seen. I've already found a couple of docs that were indie productions that I'm going to be posting over the next while. It's Beneath Skin Pod. And also, if you are a new-ish £15 or above, or well, £15 patron, and you haven't gotten your book yet, please send either me or Matt a message, and we'll get you sorted out.
I think we've got everyone, but if you haven't missed one, you can also find more about Greg Irons on gregironsarchive.com or gregirons.archive on Instagram. As I said, the name of the book, if you're looking for it on Amazon, or if you're a high-rolling tattoo artist and got money to spend, who want to try and find the hard copy, it's called You Call This Art by a writer called Peter Rosenkrantz. You can find copies of his comics fairly easily and cheaply, and even some of those underground magazines for about $30-40. And there are copies of his Tattoo Flash around as well, which also, you know, which you can find, although they're a bit more expensive. So Greg Irons is out there. People are learning more about him, and I think anyone who's listening to this who's a tattooer or a tattoo fan will find something in his whether it's the tattoo or the illustration or the poster to really get into.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for listening. It's goodbye from me.
Bye bye.